The call came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, indifferent morning that arrives in late October without ceremony, when the trees have already surrendered most of their leaves and the sky presses low and flat against the rooftops like a lid being sealed. Marlena Voss was standing at the kitchen counter in her apartment on the third floor of a building that had once been respectable and had since decided against it, spooning instant coffee granules into a chipped mug and listening to her daughter B moving around in the bedroom above. The ceiling creaked in the familiar rhythm she had come to know, the way she knew her own heartbeat. 3 steps to the left, a pause, 2 steps toward the window, another pause. B always looked out the window first thing in the morning, even at 9 years old. She approached each new day with a kind of cautious optimism, as if she wanted to verify that the world was still worth getting up for before she committed to it. Marlena envied her that. She had stopped checking the window a long time ago. The phone on the counter buzzed once, twice, and then a third time before she reached for it. The number that appeared on the screen belonged to her brother, Denton. She looked at it for a moment longer than was necessary. Denton did not call her unless he wanted something or had news he could not deliver by text. She answered. Her grandmother was gone. Passed quietly in her sleep 2 nights ago at the age of 89, in the house she had occupied for 51 years on the eastern edge of a small town called Cressfield that sat in a shallow valley 3 hours from the city where Marlena lived. Denton's voice was even as he said it, not cold exactly, but measured in the way of someone reporting a fact they had already had time to process and file away in the appropriate drawer. Marvel Voss had been old. She had been in failing health. This was not unexpected. These were the kinds of things Denton said, and Marlena heard them. But beneath his measured tone, she was already doing something else entirely. She was remembering. She was remembering the smell of her grandmother's kitchen on summer mornings, cinnamon and old wood, and something floral she had never been able to name. She was remembering the sound of the old Zenith radio playing in the back bedroom, the one her grandmother kept tuned to a station that played big band music from an era no one else in the family had lived through. She was remembering the bedroom dresser and the vanity beside the window, its surface crowded with small glass bottles and a silver-backed brush set, its mirror framed in carved walnut so dark it was nearly black. She was remembering sitting on the low stool in front of that mirror while her grandmother stood behind her and braided her hair, and the way the woman's hands moved without hesitation, certain and gentle at once, as if everything in life were that manageable if you just paid proper attention. Denton was still talking. There were arrangements to discuss, he said. There was the house to consider. Their sister Portia was already driving down, and Denton would arrive by Thursday. He assumed Marlena would come as well. She said yes, she would come. She set the phone down and stood at the counter with her coffee growing cold in her hands. Above her, B had stopped moving. The ceiling was quiet. For a moment, the apartment felt very still, the kind of stillness that arrives after something has shifted and the world is deciding how to realign itself. Marlena drank the coffee anyway, cold and grainy at the bottom, because she had learned not to waste things she had already prepared for. The drive to Cressfield took 3 hours and 20 minutes because she missed the exit. She always missed outside of the town of Belem, and added 20 minutes she did not have spare. The car she drove was a 2009 Civic with a crack in the passenger side mirror that she had been meaning to have fixed since the previous spring, and had not because fixing the mirror cost money she did not currently have available for mirrors. B sat in the back seat with a book open on her lap and the particular expression on her face that meant she was not actually reading, only using the book as a comfortable place to rest her eyes while she thought about something else. She did not ask questions during the drive, which Marlena was grateful for, because she was not yet sure what answers she had to give. Cressfield was the kind of town that inspired the word quaint in people who had not grown up there, and something more complicated in people who had. It had a main street with a hardware store and a diner and a post office and a church that had been built in 1897 and had the year carved above its door in stone, as if it needed reminding. The surrounding farmland rolled and dipped in the particular way of land that has been farmed and rested and farmed again across many generations, and the houses that dotted it at intervals wore their age with varying degrees of pride. Her grandmother's house stood at the end of a long, unpaved drive and was made of dark brick with white window frames and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides like arms held open. It had always seemed to Marlena, returning to it after stretches of absence, that the house was constitutionally optimistic. It faced outward with the confidence of something that had decided long ago to remain, and Denton's rental car was already in the drive. So was Portia's, though Portia had apparently arrived ahead of the time she had stated on the phone, which was not unusual for Portia. When Marlena came through the front door with Bea behind her and a small overnight bag over her shoulder, she found her siblings already in the living room, with the particular energy of people who have been discussing things, and paused when they heard the door. Denton was 51 and had the bearing of a man who had made decisions in boardrooms for long enough that he could no longer quite turn it off in private life. He wore a collared shirt even here, and kept his expression composed in a way that suggested he considered composed expressions a form of good manners. He kissed Marlena on the cheek and then put his hand briefly on Bea's head, in the way of someone who genuinely liked children, but had not had enough practice to be natural about it. Portia was 43, 2 years older than Marlena, and wore her silver-streaked hair in a way that cost considerably more money than it looked like it cost. She hugged Marlena with the quick efficiency of someone checking an item off a list, smiled at Bea with warmth that was real enough, and went back to the papers she had spread across the coffee table. Papers. Marlena looked at them. There was an estate inventory form. There were real estate listings for properties in comparable condition and comparable locations. There were printed pages that appeared to be from the website of an estate sale company. She had been in the house for 40 seconds. She set her bag by the stairs and went to the kitchen to put on water for tea, because she needed a moment that was not being watched, and because the kettle in her grandmother's kitchen was still the same one that had been there for 15 years. A stout electric model the color of cream with a small dent on its side from the time it had fallen off the counter during a storm, and holding it felt like holding something familiar when almost everything else had stopped being. The next several hours moved in the way of hours that contained both grief and practicality, the two pulling at each other like tides running in opposite directions. The woman from the funeral home came and went. Neighbors appeared at the door with casseroles. Marlena's cousin Bernard called from somewhere in the southwest and offered condolences, and then mentioned, not carefully, that he had always admired the sideboard in the dining room. Denton handled the neighbor casseroles with gracious efficiency. Portia took notes on her legal pad. Bea, because she was 9 and had the social survival instincts of someone who had spent her young life navigating adult rooms, found a corner of the back porch and occupied herself with her book and the large orange cat who had apparently lived with her great-grandmother for years, and whose name, she discovered from a handwritten note on his food bowl, was Franklin. Marlena checked on her twice and found her reading with the cat in her lap, which seemed like the best possible outcome for the evening. It was late, past 10, when Denton finally spread his hands on the dining room table and said what he had apparently been building toward since Marlena arrived. The house needed to be liquidated, he said. Not because anyone was greedy, he was careful to say that. Not because anyone wanted to rush the process of grief, but because it was a practical matter. The house required maintenance. They were not positioned to provide from a distance. The property taxes would continue. The estate would need to be settled eventually, and sooner was cleaner than later. He had spoken with an estate attorney who had confirmed the general outline. Portia had spoken with a real estate agent who had given them a preliminary number that was, Denton said with the slight pause of someone managing expectations, lower than they might have hoped, given the property's condition and the market in Crestfield. Marlena listened to all of this. She had expected all of this. She still felt, listening to it, as though the floor were very slightly tilting. There was also, Portia said, the matter of the contents. Most of it, she said, was not worth very much. Their grandmother had not been a collector of anything valuable. The furniture was old, but not antique, in the meaningful sense, which Portia had apparently learned from a brief online search. The dishes were Corel. The books were mass-market paperbacks and a set of encyclopedias that had not been current since 1988. There was a quantity of costume jewelry that would likely sell at estate sale for whatever people paid for such things. There was the bedroom set, Portia continued, the dresser, and the vanity, and the wardrobe that their grandmother had kept in the master bedroom for as long as any of them could remember. She had looked up the pieces on several resale sites, and similar pieces in better condition were selling for between $200 and $400 for the set. The condition of their grandmother's set was, she paused diplomatically, consistent with its age and use. The vanity especially, she said. Marlena knew the vanity. She had always known the vanity. It stood against the east wall of the master bedroom, with its 3-panel mirror, and its little bench upholstered in faded blue, and its surface crowded with the accumulated small objects of a long life. The frame of the mirror was carved walnut, very dark, with a design along its edges that Marlena had spent hours studying as a child. Small, repeated shapes that she had always thought looked like leaves, or perhaps waves, depending on the light. The glass in the central mirror was old, slightly silvered at the edges, in the way that old mirror glass silvered when its backing aged, and it reflected the room in a way that was almost, but not quite accurate, with a softness that made everything look slightly more dignified than it might otherwise have appeared. Her grandmother had sat at that vanity every morning. She had brushed her hair there and placed her earrings, and kept her rosary beads in the top left drawer beside her reading glasses, and a small collection of photographs she apparently preferred to keep close. Marlena, as a child, had been allowed to sit at the bench and look at herself in the mirror while her grandmother moved behind her, and she had done so with the particular solemn attentiveness of a child being permitted access to something she understood to be important without yet understanding exactly why. She wanted to keep the vanity. She said so. The silence that followed was brief but occupied. Denton looked at Portia. Portia looked at her legal pad. Then Portia said, gently, that the vanity was large, and Marlena's apartment was not. And had she considered that? Marlena said she had considered it, and she still wanted it. Denton said that the piece was not valuable from an estate perspective, and that keeping it would complicate the logistics of the estate sale, and that he understood the sentiment. He genuinely did. But they needed to be practical. Portia said that sentiment was important, but that practically speaking, the vanity was in poor condition and would be difficult to move, and if Marlena truly wanted a keepsake from their grandmother, there were smaller items that would be easier to transport and just as meaningful. So Marlena said she wanted the vanity. What she did not say, because she was not sure yet how to say it, was that she felt with a certainty she could not entirely explain that there was something important about the vanity. Not important in the sense of monetarily valuable. Important in the way that certain things accumulate importance over time, through proximity to lives that mattered, through being present for the quiet daily ceremonies of a person who knew how to live. She felt that discarding the vanity would be discarding something she could not afford to lose, and she felt this with more conviction than she could justify to two people who were thinking in columns of numbers. The conversation moved on. It came back. Portia said that if Marlena wanted the Vanity, she was of course welcome to it, but that the cost of transporting it from Cressfield to her apartment in the city would fall to Marlena, which was only fair, and that there was a question of whether the apartment building even permitted furniture of that size in the elevator, and that she wanted Marlena to understand she was not saying no, she was only raising practical questions. Marlena understood that Portia was saying no. She said nothing else that evening. She slept in her grandmother's guest room in a narrow bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar and lavender, and she lay in the dark, listening to the house settle and creak around her, the way houses do when they are very old and still adjusting to their age. Bea was asleep in the same room, on a cot brought up from the basement, a breathing with the deep, even rhythm of a child who had no unresolved questions about the evening. The orange cat Franklin had, against what were apparently the household rules, made his way upstairs and was sitting at the foot of Bea's cot in the dark, like a small orange sentinel. Marlena lay on her back with her eyes open and thought about her grandmother. Marvel Voss had been born in 1935, in a town even smaller than Cressfield, the third daughter of a man who worked in a textile mill and a woman who took in mending and ironing to supplement the family income. She had met Marlena's grandfather at a church dance in 1956 and married him the following year and moved to Cressfield when he got a job with the county roads department. So she had worked as a bookkeeper for a local hardware store for 22 years and then retired and devoted herself to her garden and her grandchildren and her church and, in her later years, to the reading of novels she borrowed from the library in stacks of 4 at a time. She had not been a woman of great wealth or grand gesture. She had been a woman of extraordinary consistency, which Marlena had come to understand, as she got older, was its own form of greatness. Her grandmother had shown up for things. She had shown up for the small, ordinary moments and the large, important ones with the same quality of attention, the same steadiness, the same refusal to treat any moment as less significant than it actually was. When Marlena's own marriage had ended 5 years ago, when her husband had left with the kind of quiet, disappointed finality that was somehow worse than anger, it had been her grandmother she had called. Not her mother, not Denton, not Portia. Her grandmother, who had listened without interrupting and then said, with neither drama nor false comfort, that hard things happened to good people for no reason that made sense at the time, and that what mattered was what you did with the days that came after. That was the kind of woman she had been. And in the morning, Marlena got up before the others were awake and went to the master bedroom. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the familiar arrangement of the room, the way the morning light fell across the bedspread that was still turned back from the night her grandmother had last slept in it and never returned. The room smelled of her, of the violet water she had kept in a blue glass bottle on the nightstand, and the cedar sachets in the wardrobe, and the particular old house smell that had been deepened and made specific by decades of one person's presence. The Vanity stood where it always stood, against the east wall, its mirror catching the morning light. Marlena crossed the room and sat down on the little bench. The wood of the bench creaked softly under her weight. She looked at herself in the glass. In the slight softness of the old mirror, she looked younger than she felt. She looked like someone who was still deciding what she was. She put her hands on the surface of the Vanity, on the dark wood, worn smooth at the edges, where her grandmother's hands had rested for years. She ran her fingers along the carved frame of the mirror, on her tracing the repeated design she had studied as a child. Leaves or waves? Both, perhaps. She followed the carving to the upper corner of the frame, where the 2 side panels joined the top, and her fingers stopped. There was something odd at the joint, a seam that was not quite flush. She pressed gently, and the wood did not give, but she felt very clearly that the construction at that corner was not what it appeared to be. Not simply carved wood fitted together in the ordinary way. There was a layer there, a thickness behind the decorative face of the frame that was not visible, but was plainly present under her fingertips. She sat very still. Outside the window, a bird called once and was quiet. Somewhere downstairs, Franklin the cat moved across a floor with the particular dignity of cats that have decided to be cooperative this morning. Marlena pressed her fingers along the top rail of the frame, moving slowly from one end to the other. The carving was uniform and continuous, but the rail itself was thicker than it needed to be for a mirror frame. Significantly thicker. She had never noticed this before because she had never had reason to think about it. A mirror frame was a mirror frame. You looked at the surface, at the carved design, at the dark beauty of the walnut, not at the depth of the structure behind it. She stood and stepped back, looking at the vanity from a slight distance. The proportions she had always accepted without question now offered themselves to her with a different emphasis. The frame was, now that she was specifically attending to it, quite unusually substantial. Not delicately carved wood surrounding a mirror. Something more. A structure. A frame that was doing more than holding a mirror. She heard a door open down the hall. Denton's room. She heard him moving toward the bathroom with the deliberate early morning footsteps of a man who had places to be and things to settle. She looked at the vanity for one more moment, then arranged her expression into something neutral and went downstairs to start the coffee. Breakfast was eggs that Marlena scrambled and toast from bread she found in the bread box, slightly stale but perfectly functional, the kind of bread her grandmother had always kept, the soft white kind from the supermarket that Portia had stopped eating years ago for reasons she occasionally mentioned and then apologized for mentioning. Bea ate with the uncomplicated appetite of a child and fed small pieces of her toast to Franklin, who had apparently decided that the no cats in the kitchen rule had died with its enforcer. Denton read emails on his phone. Portia made notes. After breakfast, the estate attorney came to go through the formal paperwork, and then a woman from the estate sale company came to walk through the house and assess the contents, and the morning became a sequence of practical conversations that Marlena participated in with one part of her mind, while the other part remained in the master bedroom with its fingers pressed against the corner of a mirror frame. The estate sale woman was brisk and kind in equal measure, the way of professionals who spend their working days in the rooms of people who have just died and have learned that the grief and the practicality are both real and do not cancel each other out. She moved through the house with a clipboard and spoke in the shorthand of her trade. She said of the vanity what Portia had already said. "Nice piece," she said, but the condition and the regional market meant limited buyer interest. She could sell it, certainly, but Marlena should not expect significant return. "How much?" Marlena asked, as though she were weighing her options. The woman considered. 200. Perhaps 250 if the right buyer came on the right day. More likely 175 as a set with the dresser and wardrobe. Marlena nodded as if she were filing this information for later use. She did not mention that she had already decided to keep the vanity. She was not sure yet why she was not mentioning it. After the estate sale woman left, and Denton had gone to take a call in the drive, and Portia was on the phone with the real estate agent, Marlena went back upstairs. She moved quietly, not because she was hiding anything, she told herself, but because she needed to think. And thinking was easier when she was not being watched or consulted or gently redirected toward the practical. She sat at the vanity again. She pressed her hands flat against the top rail of the frame, then the sides, then the bottom. The sides were the same, thick and solid, with that slightly excessive depth she had noticed earlier. The bottom rail, where the frame met the shelf that held the mirror's base, was thicker still, and she could see now, looking closely, that the shelf itself was not as shallow as it appeared. There was a space behind the carved facing of the shelf, not a decorative depth, a real one. She tried to think like her grandmother. Marlena Voss had been a bookkeeper for 22 years. She understood money. She had also lived through a particular period of American history, the mid-20th century, in which certain attitudes about financial institutions and the safety of savings had shaped the habits of people who had been young during difficult times. Her grandmother had not, to Marlena's knowledge, had significant savings. She had lived simply, and after her husband died in 1998, on a combination of Social Security and a small pension from the county. There had never been any discussion of significant assets. The estate, as Denton had handled it with the attorney, was modest. The house, such as it was. The car, which was a 2003 Buick that Marlena privately thought might be worth more as memory than as vehicle. The ordinary contents of an ordinary life. But Marlena's grandmother had grown up in a household that did not trust banks. Her own mother, by family account, had kept cash in a tin box in the back of a closet, a habit born of the Depression that she had never fully relinquished even in more prosperous times. Marvel had grown up watching this, and had almost certainly absorbed something of the attitude behind it, even if she had translated it into other forms. She had been, Marlena remembered with sudden clarity, deeply private about financial matters. She had deflected questions. She had changed the subject when money came up in family conversations. Not uncomfortably, not in the manner of someone hiding something shameful, but in the manner of someone who considered certain things genuinely nobody else's business. She had also, Marlena now remembered, been visited once, when Marlena was in her early 20s, by a man in a suit who had introduced himself as a financial advisor and whose visit Marvel had treated with the polite formality she reserved for things she was going to handle in her own way, regardless of what anyone else suggested. Marlena had been there for that visit and had observed her grandmother nod attentively at the man's explanations and thank him graciously when he left. And then, when he was gone, sit down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and say nothing about it at all, which Marlena had understood even then to mean that she had already made up her mind and the meeting had been courteous theater. She pressed her hands against the frame again. Her fingers found the seam at the inner edge of the rail where the decorative facing met the mirror's backing, and she pressed, and something shifted. It was the smallest movement. Not a click, not a release of any visible mechanism. Just the very slight give of something that had been held in one position for a long time and was acknowledging pressure. She let up and pressed again, gently, at different points along the rail, and on the fourth attempt, she felt the facing of the bottom shelf shift inward by perhaps the depth of a thumbnail, and she heard, very quietly, the soft sound of something that had been sealed yielding against its seal. She sat back on the bench. Her heart was moving in her chest with more intention than usual. She looked toward the closed bedroom door. She could hear Portia on the phone in the downstairs hall. Denton was still outside. Bea was in the backyard with Franklin. She had seen them through the kitchen window a few minutes ago. She looked at the vanity. She pressed the bottom rail again, found the same guive, held the pressure, and this time used her other hand to grip the edge of the decorative facing and pulled gently forward. It did not come away entirely. It was attached at the bottom by what appeared to be a narrow hinge, but it swung outward, forward, about 3 inches, and in the space that opened behind it, Marlena saw something that stopped the air in her lungs. Not emptiness, not the bare wood of a shelf's interior, but paper. Stacked paper. Many, many sheets of paper, like arranged with the careful precision of someone who had been very deliberate about what they were preserving and how they were preserving it. The paper was held in envelopes. The envelopes were in the clear archival sleeves that Marlena recognized from her grandmother's habit of storing important documents carefully. And on the face of the topmost envelope, visible through the plastic sleeve, were printed words that she stared at for several seconds before they resolved into meaning. She reached in and withdrew the envelope, slowly, handling it with the instinct of someone who understands, without needing to be told that this object requires care. She turned it over and looked at the front. Her hand was not quite steady. The envelope bore the name and seal of a financial institution. The paper inside it, the visible through the envelope's windowed face, was a bearer bond. She knew what bearer bonds were because she had been a loan processor for 7 years at a bank in the city, and she had handled instruments of this type, which had largely fallen out of use, but which were still valid, still negotiable, still representing exactly the value printed on their face. The value printed on the face of the bond, visible through the envelope window, was $100,000. She set the envelope down on the surface of the vanity. She reached in again and withdrew the next envelope, and the next. She laid them out in a row, 8 envelopes in that first layer. She reached deeper and found another layer, also 8. And below that a third, and below that a fourth, and the space behind the bottom rail was deeper than it had any right to be. Why, because this was not a hidden compartment that had been constructed as an afterthought. It was a compartment that had been built into the frame deliberately and precisely, concealed behind a facing that was so perfectly matched to the surrounding construction that no one in decades of living with and looking at this piece of furniture had apparently noticed it. She stacked the envelopes on the vanity surface and counted them, then counted again. Because the first count seemed like a number her mind was not quite prepared to accept. She opened one of the archival sleeves carefully and slid the envelope out and held it up to the light. The paper was thick and formal, with the particular authority of financial instruments from an era when such things were made to last. The denomination was $100,000. She checked another, some the same, and another, and a fourth that was different, denominated at 500,000, and she stared at that number for a long moment, with a feeling she could not immediately name. She was still sitting at the vanity with the bonds laid out before her when she heard Denton's footsteps on the stairs. She did not move to conceal what she had found. There was something in her that was past concealment, past the careful management of impressions that the last 24 hours had required of her. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited. He appeared in the doorway and stopped. He looked at the vanity, at the envelopes laid out on its surface, at the open compartment in the frame, at Marlena sitting on the little bench with her back straight and her hands still. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, what is that? Marlena looked at the bonds. She looked at the frame of the mirror, at the carved walnut that she had traced with her fingers as a child, at the design she had always thought looked like leaves or waves. She looked at the reflection of the room in the old glass, softened and silvered at the edges. She said she was not entirely sure yet, but she thought they should probably call an attorney before they called anyone else. Denton crossed the room in 4 steps and stood beside her at the vanity. He did not touch anything. He looked at the envelopes arrayed across the surface, and then at the open compartment in the frame, and then back at the envelopes. He picked one up, finally, and turned it over in his hands, and she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions that she had rarely seen on Denton's face before. Surprise, carefully managed. Confusion, less carefully managed. And beneath both of those, something more complicated that she could not quite read. He said the name of a financial institution, a question. She said, yes, that was what it appeared to be. He asked if she had counted them. She had. There were 31 envelopes in total. She had not opened all of them. She had not wanted to open them without another person present, and partly she had not wanted to open them alone because she was not sure what she would do if the number turned out to be what she suspected it was. She had wanted a witness, even a witness who had spent the previous evening telling her the Vanity was not worth keeping. Denton set the envelope down and stood with both hands resting on the Vanity surface, looking at the compartment. He was quiet for long enough that Marlena heard, distantly, Portia's voice downstairs, concluding her phone call. Then Denton straightened and said she was right. They needed an attorney. Not the estate attorney, he said. A different one. Someone who specialized in financial instruments. He took out his phone and began scrolling. Portia appeared in the doorway approximately 3 minutes later, drawn upstairs by the silence that had replaced her brother's footsteps and Marlena's voice. She looked at the envelopes. She looked at the open compartment. She looked at Marlena and Denton, and she came into the room and picked up one of the envelopes and examined it with the intensity of someone who manages documents professionally and knows how to read them quickly. Her face went through its own sequence of expressions, briefer than Denton's, more controlled. She set the envelope down. She said, very quietly, that she thought they should not touch anything else. Marlena said she agreed. Then Portia looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had arrived in Cressfield, and said, "How did you know?" And Marlena said she had not known. She had only felt that the Vanity mattered. That was all. She had only been paying attention. Portia looked at the mirror for a moment. Then she looked at Marlena again, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of theatrical revelations, but in the quiet way of someone adjusting an assumption they have been carrying for a long time without examining it carefully enough. She said nothing. But something had changed. They did not open the remaining envelopes that evening. Denton reached a financial attorney he knew through professional connections, a woman named Harriet Chen, who was based in the city, and who, when he explained the situation in brief and careful terms, said she would drive down the following morning. In the meantime, she said, do not move anything. Do not photograph anything on personal devices, and under no circumstances contact a buyer, an appraiser, or a media outlet. This last instruction she delivered with the emphasis of someone who had seen people in unusual situations make that particular error before. They covered the envelopes with a clean pillowcase from the linen closet, because none of them could think of a better interim measure, and they closed the bedroom door, and they went downstairs and ate dinner from the casseroles the neighbors had brought, and they did not talk about what was in the bedroom. B, who was 9 and sharp as a tack, ate her dinner and looked from one adult to another with the patient expression of a child who is determined that something significant is happening and that she will learn more about it by waiting than by asking. She did not ask. After dinner, she helped Marlena wash up and then went to find Franklin and did not push. That night, Marlena lay again in the narrow guest bed and tried to sleep and did not. The house settled and creaked. Franklin moved through the hall at some point, see his collar tag clicking softly against the floor. Down the hall, in the master bedroom behind the closed door, 31 envelopes lay on the surface of a walnut vanity that her siblings had been prepared to sell for $175. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about a woman who had been a bookkeeper for 22 years, who understood numbers with the quiet and total confidence of someone for whom numbers had never been abstract, who had grown up in a household where money kept under a mattress or in a tin box was not eccentricity, but wisdom, hard-won and passed down like any other form of practical knowledge, who had been visited by a financial advisor in a suit and had listened to him with courteous attention, and then, when he was gone, sat down with her tea and said nothing at all. See, what had her grandmother done instead of whatever that advisor had suggested? What had a careful private woman with a bookkeeper's mind done with money she did not want to discuss and did not want managed by people she did not know? She thought about bearer bonds. Bearer bonds, which she knew from her years at the bank, were instruments that had been common in earlier decades of the 20th century, instruments that functioned essentially as cash, in that whoever held them could redeem them. They did not require registration. They did not require an account. They did not require a relationship with a financial institution or the disclosure of personal information to anyone. They were, for someone of her grandmother's disposition, a form of savings that was private, portable, and completely outside the mechanisms of oversight that her grandmother had apparently found uncomfortable. They had been largely discontinued by the federal government starting in the early 1980s due to their use in tax avoidance, which was something else she knew from her banking years. Existing bonds remained valid. They continued to earn interest in some cases, or had matured and held their face value, depending on the specific instrument. They were complicated from a legal standpoint, and their estate implications were significant. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what 31 envelopes might mean. She did not let herself calculate. Not yet. She was afraid that if she let herself calculate, she would start planning, and if she started planning, she would build something in her mind that might not survive contact with the reality of the morning, and she had built things in her mind before that had not survived contact with reality, and she knew exactly how that felt. She thought instead about B, about the way B looked out the window every morning to verify the world before she committed to it, about the crack in the passenger side mirror of the 2009 Civic, about the apartment where the heat in the back bedroom did not work reliably in January, and she had not reported it to the landlord because she was 3 months behind on rent, and she did not want to invite attention, about the letter from B's school that she had read twice and put at the back of a kitchen drawer because she could not yet think about what it was asking her to think about. She thought about her grandmother's hands, moving through gray hair with the certainty of someone who had learned patience as a practice, not a gift, braiding a child's hair at a vanity mirror and seeing something in the softened old glass that she did not say aloud, whatever it was she saw there. She must have slept eventually, because morning came with the abruptness of mornings that arrive before you are quite ready for them. Harriet Chen arrived at 10:30 in a dark sedan and wearing the kind of suit that said she had driven 3 hours from the city and chosen to look like she had not. She was in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, and a manner that was brisk without being cold. So the manner of someone who dealt daily with situations that required both efficiency and discretion, and had become very good at both. She shook hands with all 3 siblings, and with B, who shook back with the gravity of a child who has been raised to take handshakes seriously, and then she asked to be taken upstairs. In the master bedroom, she stood in front of the vanity for a long time without speaking. She put on her reading glasses and leaned close to examine the compartment's construction. She looked at the hinge mechanism that allowed the facing to swing forward. She looked at the depth of the space behind the bottom rail and the similar spaces behind the side rails, which Marlena had not yet explored, but which Harriet now pressed and released with the methodical precision of someone running a diagnostic. The left rail produced a compartment. This one held more envelopes, packed tightly. Different denominations, Harriet noted without apparent emotion. The right rail produced a smaller space, and in it was a document that was not a bond, but appeared to be a handwritten inventory, several pages in the careful penmanship of someone who had learned to write when penmanship was still taught with the seriousness of a discipline. Harriet did not unfold the inventory document. She took photographs with a small professional camera she had brought for the purpose. She photographed the compartments, the envelopes, the inventory pages, the construction of the vanity frame from several angles. She worked without commentary, pausing occasionally to make notes in a small leather notebook. When she had finished, she removed her reading glasses, let them hang on their chain, and turned to face the 3 siblings who had been standing in the doorway of the bedroom watching her work. She said she wanted to take the inventory document, with their permission, to examine properly. She said the envelopes would need to be handled by a specialist in historical financial instruments, and she knew someone she trusted who could be in Cressfield within 48 hours if they wanted to proceed in that direction. She said they should understand that this was a complex legal situation with implications for estate settlement, tax obligations, and potentially federal reporting requirements, and that they should not discuss what they had found with anyone outside this room until the full scope of the discovery was properly understood. She looked at all 3 of them in turn. She said lastly that her preliminary assessment, based on what she could see, was that they were looking at a collection of securities that was significantly larger than anything the existing estate filing reflected, and that the estate attorney would need to be informed, and the filing would need to be amended, and that this would take time and careful handling, but that the instruments, if authentic, were negotiable, and the value would be real. Portia asked her to estimate. Harriet said she preferred not to estimate before the specialist examined the instruments. Then she paused, because Portia's face was the face of someone who was going to ask again, and she said that her conservative instinct, purely from what she could see, suggested they were not discussing a small supplementary sum. She said they might be discussing something considerably more than that. The room was very quiet. Denton sat down on the edge of the bed, which none of them had done since arriving, because it was their grandmother's bed, and it felt intrusive. But he sat down on it, now, because there was nowhere else to sit, and his legs had apparently decided they needed a moment. Portia looked at the vanity. Then she looked at Marlena. Her expression was the most open Marlena had seen it since childhood, stripped of the careful management she usually maintained. And in it was something that Marlena recognized not as guilt exactly, but as the beginning of understanding. Marlena looked at the mirror. In the old glass, softened and silvered at the edges, she could see the reflection of the room. The bed, the wardrobe, her siblings, and the morning light coming through the white curtains. She could see herself, sitting on the little bench in the same position she had occupied as a child, while her grandmother stood behind her. She looked like someone who was beginning to understand something important, which was exactly what she was. The specialist arrived 41 hours later, on a Friday morning when the light was clean and cold, and the frost on the grass had not yet burned off. His name was Gerald Mack, and he was 63 years old, and had spent the previous 30 years working in securities authentication for a firm in Chicago before retiring into what he called consulting, which appeared to mean being called by Harriet Chen when something required the combination of expertise, discretion, and willingness to drive to a small town in October on short notice that Gerald Mack apparently embodied. He arrived with a case that contained equipment Marlena did not recognize, as well as what appeared to be reference materials and a pair of magnifying glasses of different strengths. He was a compact, precise man, with small, neat hands, and the focused quality of someone for whom the details of things were genuinely interesting, rather than merely necessary, which Marlena respected, because she had worked with people for whom the details were necessary, and people for whom they were genuinely interesting, and they were not the same thing, and the difference was usually visible in how they held their instruments. He greeted them, and was introduced, and then asked to be left alone with the pieces for an hour, on a request they honored, because Harriet had prepared them for it, and because there was something about Gerald Mack's manner that made you want to give him the conditions he asked for. They went downstairs and sat in the living room. Portia made tea, and then did not drink it. Denton looked at his phone, and then put it face down on the cushion beside him. B, who had been enrolled in a kind of unofficial temporary school at the kitchen table, courtesy of a stack of books Marlena had brought from the city and a series of math worksheets the school had sent, came to the doorway of the living room at one point, read the room, and went back to the kitchen without saying anything. Franklin sat on the arm of the sofa and surveyed the situation with the equanimity of a creature who has decided that uncertainty is not his department. They were quiet for a while. Then Portia said, without looking up from her tea, that she wanted to say something. Marlena waited. Portia said she wanted to say she was sorry. Not in an elaborate way, not with qualifications, which she acknowledged was sometimes how she communicated, and which she acknowledged was not always useful. She said that when Marlena had said she wanted the vanity, Portia had heard sentiment, and she had responded to it practically, which she now understood had been its own form of not listening. She said she did not know, obviously, that there was anything extraordinary about the piece. But she was not sure that changed the fundamental thing she wanted to say, which was that she had not been listening to what Marlena was actually telling her. Marlena looked at her sister, while Portia was looking at her tea with the expression of someone who has prepared a speech and is now wondering if it was the right speech. Marlena said she appreciated that. She meant it. She looked out the window at the yard where the last of the leaves were coming down from the big oak, one and two at a time, spiraling slowly through the cold air. She thought about her grandmother, about being shown how to pay attention, about the difference between looking at a thing and seeing it. She said to Portia that she thought their grandmother had wanted someone to find what was in the vanity, that she had not been careless about it, that she had been waiting to see who would be paying enough attention. Portia was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought that was probably true. Gerald Mack came downstairs at 11:47, which Marlena knew because she had been watching the clock with the involuntary precision of someone waiting for a verdict. He came into the living room and sat in the chair across from the sofa and opened his notebook and set his reading glasses on his nose and looked at them with an expression that was careful and not unkind. He said he wanted to walk them through what he had found. The envelopes in the bottom rail compartment, he said, contained 31 bearer bonds. He had examined each one. They were authentic. He had verified the issuances, the serial numbers, the physical paper composition, the printing characteristics, and the institutional seals against reference records. And there was no question of forgery or reproduction. These were genuine instruments issued by recognized institutions over a period spanning approximately 22 years, from the mid-1950s through the late 1970s. He paused. He looked at his notes. The denominations varied. 14 of the bonds were issued in $100,000 face values. 6 were issued in $250,000 face values. 8 were issued in $500,000 face values. 3 were issued in $1 million face values. He paused again. He said he wanted to be careful here because the question of current value was more complicated than face value alone, for several reasons. Bearer bonds of this vintage could have matured or accrued interest depending on their specific type and terms. Some had, and some had not. The instruments in the side rail compartment were a different type, a type of registered bond that had been converted from bearer status in the early 1980s under the legal changes of that era, and those had more complex valuation questions that would require additional analysis. He said he could give them a preliminary range, understanding that this was genuinely preliminary and that the full picture would take several weeks of proper analysis. The face value of the instruments in the bottom compartment, he said, was approximately $97 million. The room absorbed this. Gerald Mack continued, because he was a professional, and professionals continue. He said the side rail bonds added complexity, He said the inventory document from the right rail contained a handwritten record of purchases and apparent tracking of values, and that based on what he could read in the document, the accumulation appeared to represent a deliberate and sustained investment strategy conducted over a period of roughly 3 decades by someone with considerable financial sophistication. He said the inventory document would require careful analysis and possibly authentication in its own right. He said that his preliminary estimate of total value, inclusive of all instruments and their likely accrued positions, fell in a range that he wanted to present carefully. He looked at his notes. He said that his conservative estimate was in the range of $240 million. His more complete estimate, pending full analysis, might be somewhat higher. He had seen similar portfolios, though not many, and he believed $240 million was a responsible floor to present at this stage. He looked at them over his reading glasses. Portia set down her teacup. The sound it made on the saucer was very small in a room that had become very large. Denton put both his hands flat on his knees, a gesture Marlena had seen him make before in moments of significant recalibration, and looked at the middle distance. Marlena looked at her hands in her lap. Gerald Mack was speaking again. He was explaining the legal and procedural path forward, the necessity of formal authentication by a recognized securities authority, the federal reporting requirements, the estate implications, the tax considerations, the timeline. She heard the words. They registered in some orderly part of her mind and were filed for later. In the immediate moment, she was doing something else. She was sitting in her grandmother's living room, what in the house that had been her grandmother's house for 51 years, and she was understanding something. She understood that a woman who had grown up with a tin box in a closet had translated that inherited instinct into something larger, into a kind of patient, private, long-horizon financial intelligence that no one in the family had known about because she had not chosen to share it. Not out of secrecy, exactly, not out of distrust, but out of the same quality of mind that had kept her from discussing the financial advisor's visit or volunteering information about money to people who had not demonstrated they were ready to receive it responsibly. She had been waiting, and because it was in the nature of bearer instruments that they passed to whoever held them, and because they were in a compartment, in a piece of furniture that had been left with no specific instructions, the question of who they passed to was, legally, a matter that Harriet would have to navigate carefully. But their grandmother had known her children and grandchildren. She had known who among them paid attention. She had known who sat at the vanity bench and traced the carved frame with their fingers and thought about leaves and waves. She had known what she was doing when she chose this particular form, this particular hiding place, this particular piece of furniture that one person in her family would fight to keep, and another would be prepared to sell for $175. Bea appeared in the doorway of the living room. She had Franklin draped over one arm and was looking at her mother with the expression of a child who is determined that the significant thing is reaching a stage that requires her attention. Marlena looked at her daughter. Bea said carefully, "Are you okay, Mom?" Marlena said, "Yes." She said, "Come here," and Bea came and sat beside her on the sofa, and Franklin transferred himself from Bea's arm to the space between them with the serene self-possession of a cat who understands that comfort is his primary function. Marlena put her arm around Bea's shoulders. Gerald Mack had finished speaking. He was waiting, in the patient way of someone accustomed to waiting while people processed things. Marlena said to the room that she had one question. She said she wanted to know, from a legal standpoint, whether her grandmother had had any specific intention recorded anywhere regarding what she wanted done with the vanity. Harriet, who had been sitting quietly in the corner chair throughout Gerald's presentation, said that was the right question. She said she had been thinking about the inventory document. She said that if the document contained language indicating testamentary intent, that would affect the estate analysis. She said she would need to examine it fully. They went back upstairs together. All of them, even B, carrying Franklin, who was apparently committed to the situation. Harriet spread the inventory document on the surface of the vanity under the light from the window. The pages were handwritten in her grandmother's careful script, the same handwriting that Marlena knew from years of birthday cards and holiday letters. The neat penmanship of a woman who had learned to write with real conviction about the importance of legibility. The document was organized in the manner of a ledger, with columns and dates and the kind of notes that reflected the mind of someone who had tracked things systematically across many years. The last page was different from the others. It was not a ledger entry. It was a letter, short and clear and in the same careful hand, but addressed not to a financial institution or a legal entity, addressed to the family. Harriet read it aloud. It said that the instruments described in the foregoing inventory were to be understood as belonging to the estate and were to be distributed with the house and its contents to such members of the family as demonstrated the care and attention to remain in relationship with what matters. It said this in language that was not legal language, but was the language of a woman who knew what she meant and trusted that the people she was talking to would understand. It said that the vanity and its contents were not to be sold or distributed outside the family, but were to be kept together, and that whoever kept the vanity kept what was in it, which was a simple practical instruction and also something more than that. And the last sentence of the letter was clear and unambiguous and 5 words long. Pay attention. It matters. Harriet finished reading. She set the pages down. In the mirror of the vanity, in the old silver-edged glass, Marlena could see the room reflected. Her brother with his hand over his mouth, her sister with her eyes very bright, B leaning into her side with Franklin on her arm, watching the mirror with the same focused attention she brought to windows in the morning. That patient optimism, that careful verification of the world. And in her own face, reflected in the softened glass, she saw something she had not seen there for a long time. Not joy, exactly. Not relief, though both of those were present. Something older and more grounded. The face of someone who had been paying attention and had been right to pay attention, and was now in the process of understanding what that meant. Outside the window, the last of the leaves were coming down from the oak. The frost had burned off, and the light was clean and direct on the frosted grass and the old brick of the house that had been her grandmother's house for 51 years, and that still held. So in its walls and its rooms, and in the dark walnut frame of an old vanity mirror, the accumulated evidence of a life lived with uncommon care. The formal authentication process began the following week and unfolded over the course of the next several months with the particular combination of meticulous procedure and occasional astonishment that characterized processes of this kind. Harriet coordinated with the estate attorney to file amended documentation reflecting the discovered assets. The securities authentication firm Gerald Mack had worked with for 3 decades undertook a full analysis of each instrument. Federal reporting obligations were navigated with the careful guidance of a tax specialist Harriet brought into the matter. The final authenticated value, when the complete analysis was complete, was $302 million. Marlena received this number on a Thursday morning in December, sitting in Harriet's office in the city, with B beside her, because B was not in school that day due to a teacher professional development day, which B had noted was an odd name for the day because the teachers were presumably already developed. The number was presented in a formal document that Harriet slid across the desk with the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned to present significant information without adding to it her own emotional response. She had also prepared a briefing on the distribution implications, the tax obligations, and the proposed structure for managing the assets going forward. Marlena looked at the number on the document for a long time. $302 million. Bea, beside her, was looking at the number too. B, who was 9 and had been told in general terms that something significant had been found in great-grandmother's Vanity, who had watched her mother drive back and forth to Crestfield 3 times in the preceding weeks, who had observed the telephone calls and the attorney visits and the quiet, sustained intensity of her mother's attention to something that was unresolved, and who had waited with the patience of a child who understands that some things take the time they take. Bea read the number and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, simply, "Oh, good." And something about the uncomplicated adequacy of that response, the way it accepted the fact without needing to ornament it, broke something open in Marlena that had been held very carefully in place for a long time. Not grief, not quite. Something that lives alongside grief and is not exactly joy, but is something essential to surviving, to continuing. She put her arm around Bee's shoulders and held her, and Bee leaned in without question, and Harriet found something on her desk that required her attention for a moment, which was the professional thing to do. When Marlena had composed herself, which did not take long, because she was a woman who had learned to move through the difficult and necessary moments without letting them stop her, she looked up and asked Harriet what came next. Harriet told her. And the telling took some time, because what came next was complicated and would require decisions, and Marlena would need to understand what she was deciding. But underneath the complexity was a simple foundation, which was that the estate had been settled and the assets properly identified, and Marlena Voss, who had fought to keep a Vanity her siblings thought was worthless, who had sat on a little bench in the early morning and paid attention with her fingertips, was the primary beneficiary of an inheritance that would change everything about how the days ahead of her were going to look. She did not let herself feel the full scope of it yet. She was still in the stage of understanding, which was its own kind of work. But she let herself feel one thing clearly. She felt grateful. Not for the money, though the money was real and its implications were real, and she would let herself feel those fully in time. She felt grateful for her grandmother, for a woman who had understood, across the whole long span of her careful life, that how you held your attention was how you held your values, and that the two things were not separate, and that she had tried, in the way that she had, to pass that understanding along. Pay attention. It matters. The first thing Marlena did, when the legal scaffolding had been properly erected, and the initial distributions had been authorized, and the number had moved from the territory of document into the territory of reality, was fix the mirror in the car. She drove to the auto glass place on Hendrick Street that she had been passing for 8 months with the intention of stopping, and had not stopped at because the mirror cost $220, and $220 had represented in the mathematics of her life up to that point, on a category of expenditure that required postponement, pending other conditions being met. She pulled into the lot and told the man at the counter what she needed, and he said he could have it done in 45 minutes. She sat in the plastic chair in the waiting area and drank the complimentary coffee, which was bad, and felt, in a way she hadn't quite allowed herself to feel yet, the specific texture of a problem solved. Not a large problem, not the kind of problem that would have kept her up at night, or that she would have listed, if asked to list her difficulties, among the significant ones. A small problem, the kind that accumulates, the kind that, in accumulation, becomes the permanent background condition of a life lived with not quite enough, a low constant static of deferred maintenance and managed insufficiency. almost so familiar after years that you stop hearing it as noise and start hearing it as silence, as the normal sound of things. She heard the absence of it now. When the mirror was done, she sat in the car in the lot and looked at it, clean and correctly angled, reflecting the street behind her with the precision of something functioning as intended. It was a small thing. She let it be a small thing. She also let it be the first of many. The second thing she did was call the school. The letter in the kitchen drawer, the one she had read twice and put away because she could not yet think about what it was asking her to think about, had been from B's teacher, a woman named Ms. Howell, who had been teaching 4th grade for 11 years and who wrote with the careful specificity of someone who wanted to be taken seriously. It said that B was an exceptional student, that her comprehension and critical thinking were significantly above grade level, that the school had a gifted and talented program that accepted applications each spring, that the application required supporting documentation and a family interview, and a commitment to certain programming that would require some logistical adjustments, that Ms. Howell strongly believed B would thrive in the program, and that she hoped the family would consider it. Marlena had put the letter in the drawer because logistical adjustments had been a phrase that meant, in the practical terms of her life at the time, things she could not afford. The program required supplementary materials. It required, in some cases, travel to a different school building on certain days. It required the investment of time and resources in a structured way that she had not been positioned to make. She called Ms. Howell and told her they would like to apply. She heard the warmth in Ms. Howell's voice, the particular warmth of a teacher who has been waiting for the right answer and has had to practice not showing how much she was hoping for it. She said that was wonderful news. She said Bay was going to do extraordinary things. Marlena said she knew. The third thing, which was not really a thing, but was more of a process that unfolded across several weeks, was telling people. She had not told anyone outside the immediate family and the legal team while the authentication was ongoing. Harriet had been clear about that, and she had agreed not because she was told to, but because she understood, from her own instincts, the importance of understanding a thing fully before offering it to the interpretation of others. She had held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile while you are still figuring out its weight. When she did begin to tell people, it was not in the manner of announcement. It was in the manner of conversation, the way significant things become known among people who know each other, gradually and without theater. She told her friend Donica first, over coffee in Donica's kitchen, which was where the two of them had been having the important conversations of their adult friendship for a decade. Donica had been there for the marriage, and for what came after the marriage, had brought food, and stayed late, and never once said anything that was unhelpful about the future. She listened to Marlena tell the story of the Vanity and Cressfield, and the compartments in the frame, and the inventory document, and Gerald Mack with his magnifying glasses. And when Marlena finished, Donica looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "I always knew your grandmother was remarkable, and I did not know the half of it." They sat with that for a while, in the comfortable way of old friends who have learned not to fill every silence. Then Danica said, practically, "What are you going to do?" Marlena said she had been thinking about that. She had been thinking about it with the same quality of attention she had used in the master bedroom in Cressfield, slow and careful and willing to stay with uncertainty until something clarified. She was not going to make large decisions quickly, she said, and she was going to take the time that the situation allowed her to take, which was a luxury she had not previously had, and she was going to make decisions that were right in the long term, not decisions that were satisfying in the immediate. Danica said that sounded like her grandmother talking. Marlena said she thought it probably was. There were people who heard the news and responded in the way of people who had always been fond of Marlena and were genuinely glad for her, and that gladness was straightforward and warm, and she received it with gratitude and without suspicion. There were also people who responded in ways that were more complicated, who appeared suddenly more interested in maintaining contact than they had previously been, who brought up in conversation things they had once needed help with or were currently navigating. And she observed this without bitterness, because she understood it as simply the way of things, the way that changes in circumstance reveal the pre-existing architecture of relationships, and she filed the information accordingly. The ones who surprised her were her colleagues at the bank. She had been a loan processor for 7 years at the same institution, a regional bank with a downtown location and 3 branches in the surrounding area. She had processed loans and reviewed applications and maintained files and attended the quarterly meetings where the branch manager presented numbers in a way that made them sound like accomplishments when they were in fact simply numbers. She had been good at her job in the quiet, thorough way that people who are good at their jobs often are, without drawing much attention to the quality, and she had been appreciated in the vague institutional way that organizations appreciate the reliable functioning of their systems without always connecting that functioning to the specific human beings who produce it. She gave her notice on a Thursday morning. She sat across from her manager, a man named Rolf, who she had always thought meant well and was simply not a very imaginative person, and told him she was resigning. He expressed the appropriate regret. He asked, because he was the kind of person who needed to fill silence with something, if she had another position. She said she was going to take some time before her next step. He nodded in the way of someone who understood that this answer contained information he was not going to receive. When she left the building that Thursday afternoon, and she stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment in the winter light and looked at the street. The city moved around her with its usual indifferent purpose. She had walked out of that building hundreds of times over 7 years and had never stopped on the sidewalk before. There had always been the car to get to, the pickup to arrange, the dinner to start. Always the next obligation pulling her forward through the moment before she had quite finished being in it. She stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes. She let herself be in the moment. Then she went to pick up Belle from school, which was the obligation that pulled her most willingly in any direction it ever pulled her. B, in the car, said, "How was your day?" Marlena said it had been a day of things ending that should end, which was sometimes the best kind of day. B considered this. She said, "Did you mean the job?" Marlena said, "Yes." B said, "Okay." She looked out the window at the streets moving past. She said, "Will we have to move?" Marlena had been thinking about that. She said they would move, yes. Not immediately, not in the disruptive and urgent way that moving had always previously appeared in their life as possibility, as pressure. They would move thoughtfully, when they found the right place. She had some ideas. She wanted to know what B thought. B thought about it. She said she wanted to be able to have a yard. She said she wanted enough room for Franklin, if Franklin was going to continue to be their cat, which appeared to be what Franklin had decided, regardless of whether anyone had formally agreed to it. She said she wanted to be able to have her books in a room that was her own, and not have them stacked on the floor because the bookshelf was full. Marlena said all of that was entirely manageable. Bay said good. She went back to looking out the window. Then she said quietly, "Are we going to be okay?" Marlena understood the question. It was not a question about money. It was a question that a child who had grown up in a life of insufficient predictability asked when predictability seemed to be changing, because insufficient predictability was at least a known quantity, and change, even good change, was still change, and change required adjustment, and adjustment took energy, and it was legitimate to ask whether you had the energy for it. She said yes. She said they were going to be okay. She said, not in the way of people who say things to manage a child's worry, but in the way of someone who is telling the truth and knows it is the truth and is grateful that for once, the truth is also the reassuring thing. B nodded. She seemed satisfied with this answer in the way of someone who has asked the real question and received a real answer, and that is sufficient. They stopped at the grocery store on the way home, which was the same grocery store Marlena had shopped at for the past 3 years, the mid-range one with the slightly better produce section and the loyalty card she had never bothered to get because the 3% discount had seemed, in the grand accounting of her previous existence, like a sum too small to spend administrative energy on. She got the loyalty card at the customer service counter, which took 4 minutes and produced the mild satisfaction of a very small thing finally done. And then she shopped without the customary mental arithmetic, without the ongoing background calculation of what she could justify against the balance she was carrying forward without putting anything back. She bought the good olive oil. She bought the coffee that came in the bag and not the jar. She bought 3 kinds of cheese because B liked cheese and she herself liked cheese, and the category of things they could reasonably enjoy had expanded in a direction that allowed for 3 kinds. At the checkout, the woman at the register, whose name tag said Loretta, and who had been at this register on the Tuesday and Thursday evenings that Marlena shopped here for at least 2 years, without their ever having exchanged more than transactional courtesies, looked at the loyalty card and said, "You finally got one." Marlena said yes. Finally. Loretta said the avocados were very good this week. She had bought 2 herself. Marlena said she would have to try them. Loretta said she really should. And it was an entirely ordinary exchange of the kind that happens in grocery stores between people who see each other regularly without knowing each other. And there was nothing remarkable about it. And Marlena drove home thinking about it, because there was something in the simple fact of having it, of being present enough in the moment to actually have it, and that felt like its own small form of richness. She had been running through her days for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to walk through them. The conversation with Denton happened in January, over the phone on a Sunday evening, when B was asleep and the apartment was quiet, and the city outside made its ordinary winter sounds, traffic and wind, and the occasional distant siren that were the background music of urban nights. Denton had called, not the way he had called in October, with news to deliver, but in the way of someone who wanted to have an actual conversation and was slightly uncertain how to begin, which was not a mode she had seen Denton in very often, and which she found, unexpectedly, rather endearing. He said he had been thinking. He said he wanted to say something that was perhaps overdue, and that he was saying it not because the circumstances required him to, but because he thought it was simply the right thing to say. He said that he had spent years being practical about things, and that practical was not always wrong, but that he had come to understand, in the months since Cressfield, that he had sometimes used practical as a substitute for paying attention. He said he thought their grandmother had understood this about him, and about Portia too, and that the Vanity had been her way of saying that some things required more than practicality, that some things required you to actually look. He said he was glad Marlena had looked. She sat with the phone in the quiet of the apartment and felt something unknot that she had not quite known was knotted. She and Denton were not close, had not been close for years, in the way that adult siblings who have chosen different kinds of lives are often not close, not from hostility or injury, simply from divergence, from the way lives move in different directions, and the distance between them grows not dramatically, but incrementally, until it has become simply the established condition. She had accepted this the way she had accepted many established conditions, as a fact of the landscape. She said she was glad, too. She said she thought they might try to talk more. Actual talking, not logistics. Denton said he would like that. He said he had also, while he had her on the phone, been thinking about the house, about what she was going to do with it, or what the estate was going to do with it. He said he was not raising it to push toward any particular outcome. He was raising it because he realized he had an opinion he wanted to share, which was simply that he thought their grandmother had been happy there for 51 years, and that the house seemed like something worth taking care of, if there was a way to take care of it. Marlena said she had been thinking about the house, too. She had been thinking about it quite a lot, actually. She said she did not think she would sell it. She said she thought she might do something with it, that she wanted to think through more carefully first, but that the general shape of the idea was becoming clear. She did not explain the full idea that evening. She was still developing it, turning it slowly in her mind, the way you turn something in your hands to see all its sides, the way you pay attention to a thing before you act on it. She had time to develop it properly, which was new, which she was still learning to use. The full idea arrived in its finished form on a Wednesday morning in February, when she was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, the good coffee from the bag, and looking out the window at the city that was just beginning to consider becoming something other than winter. She was thinking about her grandmother. She was thinking about a woman who had understood that paying attention was a practice, not a talent, that it was something you did on purpose, something you taught if you knew how. Her grandmother had been a bookkeeper. She had managed numbers for other people, and she had managed her own with extraordinary private acumen. She had also spent 22 years in a hardware store, which was to say she had spent 22 years in the daily practical world of people who were building things and needed materials, and occasionally needed someone to help them understand what the building was going to cost. She had known how to talk to people in the language of what things actually cost and what they were actually worth, which are not always the same conversation. Marlena had spent 7 years processing loans. She had sat across from people who were trying to build something, or keep something, or start something, and she had looked at their numbers and assessed their situations, and sometimes told them yes, and sometimes told them no. And the yeses and the nos had been governed by institutional criteria that were not always the same as human criteria, and she had sometimes found that gap difficult. No, she had also spent the previous several months learning, with Harriet's patient guidance, quite a lot about how significant financial resources could be managed and directed and used in ways that produced outcomes rather than simply sitting in accounts, accumulating interest. She had learned about structures and vehicles and mechanisms that she had known about abstractly from her banking years, but had never had reason to think about concretely. She had found this education genuinely interesting, which was something she had not anticipated, and which told her something about herself that she filed away carefully. The house in Cressfield, the house that had been her grandmother's for 51 years, and that had the big oak in the yard, and the 3-sided porch, and the dark brick that faced outward, with the confidence of something that had decided long ago to remain. She was going to keep the house. She was going to restore it properly. The maintenance that Denton had rightly noted was beyond any of them to provide from a distance. But she was going to do more than that. She was going to turn the ground floor into a financial literacy center. A small one, a real one, for the women of Cressfield and the surrounding area, who needed to understand money better than they currently did, who needed a place that was neither a bank trying to sell them something, nor a government agency speaking in forms, but a place where someone who had been in the complicated arithmetic of ordinary life would sit across from them and help them actually understand. She had talked to Harriet about the structure. She had talked to a woman who ran a similar program in another state. The shape of it was clear. She was also going to fund Bee's education in the full and forward-looking way that her grandmother had apparently been funding the idea of her grandchildren's futures for decades in the secret drawers of a walnut vanity. Not just the gifted program, the whole long arc of it, the part that Marlena had tried to set aside because looking at it too closely had felt, previously, like looking at something she was not equipped to reach. She could look at it clearly now. It was within reach. She reached. She called Portia that same Wednesday morning. Now, Portia was in a meeting, her assistant said, and could she call back? Marlena said yes, of course, and went to refill her coffee. When Portia called back 20 minutes later, her voice had the slightly altered quality of someone who has emerged from a professional context into a personal one and is making the adjustment. Marlena told her about the center, about the house. Portia was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to be involved. She said she understood if Marlena wanted to do this on her own terms, and she would respect that. But she wanted to say clearly that she was interested in contributing. She had contacts in legal services, she said. She had connections to educational organizations that might be interested in partnering. Or she had spent 15 years building a professional network that she had applied almost exclusively to commercial ends, and she thought she might like to apply some of it to something that was simply good. She said this in the careful manner of someone extending an offer they are prepared to have declined, making it easy for the other person to say no gracefully. Marlena said she would like that very much. Portia exhaled, just slightly. The sound of something held carefully for a while being set down. She said their grandmother would have liked this. Marlena said she thought she would have liked it very much, and also that she would have had opinions about how to execute it, and would have expressed them directly and helpfully, which was a kind of engagement with life that she thought they could all aspire to. Portia said, with a warmth in her voice that Marlena had not heard since they were young, that was certainly true. Spring came. The city softened in the particular way of cities in spring, not dramatically, not all at once, but in installments. One warm day, and then a cold one, and then 2 warm ones, and eventually the balance tipping and staying tipped, and the trees along the streets producing their annual surprise of green, as if they had not done it every year for as long as anyone could remember. Marlena and Bay moved into the new apartment in April. It was in a building with an elevator that worked, and a super who answered texts, and a lease that she signed with the specific feeling of someone who has been on uncertain ground for a long time and has found something solid enough to stand on. Bay had a room for her books, and she had a window that looked out over a small park where the trees were doing their annual spring trick. She had arranged her books alphabetically by author on 2 shelves by Thursday, which was the same day Franklin, who had come with them from the old apartment, had identified the sunny spot on the kitchen windowsill where he intended to conduct the majority of his operations going forward, and had occupied it with finality. Bea had looked at the arrangement of her room, at the books on the shelves and the window, and Franklin on the windowsill, and said it was good. Marlena thought it was good too. The center in Cressfield opened in September, which was a year almost to the month from the Tuesday morning in late October when her phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter and Denton's number had appeared. The house had been renovated over the summer by a local contractor recommended by the hardware store that was still operating on Cressfield's main street, a fact that Marlena had found quietly appropriate. The ground floor had been opened up and made accessible and fitted with tables and chairs, and a small resource library, and a coffee station that made real coffee. And the upper floor remained as it had been with the guest room and the rooms where the family had always stayed, because Marlena intended to use it, to bring Bea there, to keep it in the way her grandmother had kept it, as a place that people were connected to by presence and attention and the willingness to return. The vanity was still there. It was in the master bedroom where it had always been, against the east wall, its mirror catching the morning light. The compartments had been professionally documented and emptied, and their construction examined by 2 people who agreed it was extraordinary cabinet work, built at some point in the early 20th century by someone with exceptional skill and either a specific purpose in mind or the kind of deep technical intelligence that produces extraordinary things without announcing itself. Nobody knew who had built it, or when her grandmother had acquired it, or how she had known what it contained. These were questions that did not have answers, and Marlena had made her peace with that, because some things are carried forward without full explanation, and the carrying is what matters, not the accounting. She still sat at the Vanity when she was at the house. Not every visit, not with ceremony, but sometimes in the mornings, when the light came through the white curtains in the way it had always come, and the house made its old sounds around her, and the world outside was doing whatever it was doing. She sat on the little bench and looked at herself in the softened glass and thought about the things her grandmother had thought about here, or some version of them, the daily private work of understanding what was important and what was not, which was a practice that required attention, which was a practice she was committed to. She thought on those mornings about what it meant to be given something. Not the money, though the money was real and had been the agent of real change, and she did not undervalue it by abstracting it. She meant something more than the money. She meant the inheritance that the money was inside of, the larger thing that her grandmother had been storing and tending and leaving for someone who was paying enough attention to find it. The practice of attention itself, the understanding that the world is full of things that matter, and that the difference between finding them and missing them is whether you are truly looking, whether you have cultivated the habit of genuine attention, as opposed to the practical busyness of a life in which there is always the next thing pulling you through the current one before you have quite finished being in it. Her grandmother had paid attention. She had paid attention to money, yes, and managed it with intelligence and patience and extraordinary result. But she had paid attention to more than that. She had paid attention to people, onto which of her grandchildren sat at the Vanity and traced the carved frame and thought about leaves and waves. She had paid attention to the quality of presence different people brought to the things in front of them. She had paid attention across decades, quietly, without announcement, and she had used what she noticed to make a decision about how to leave what she had built. Pay attention. It matters. On the day the center opened, Marlena stood in the room that had been the ground floor of her grandmother's house for 51 years and looked at the people who had come. Women from Cressfield and from the surrounding towns, some of them young, some of them older, some of them there with the specific purposefulness of people who have a particular problem they are trying to solve, and some of them there with the more diffuse but equally genuine sense that there was something they needed to understand better, and they had not previously known where to go to understand it. Portia was there, and had brought 2 colleagues who had driven from the city to see the operation. Denton was there, and had made a donation that he had called practical, which made Marlena smile. Bea was there, and had constituted herself as unofficial greeter in the doorway, shaking hands with a gravity that made several of the adult visitors visibly charmed, which Bea accepted with the grace of someone who is aware of the effect and considers it a reasonable tool. Ms. Howell from the school had driven down, though she had not been specifically invited, because she had heard about the center through the kind of networks that exist in communities where people pay attention to what other people are doing, and she wanted to see it. She had shaken Marlena's hand at the door and said what a wonderful thing this is. Marlena had said she was glad to see her, and meant it. The contractor who had renovated the house was there, a man named Walt, who had grown up in Cressfield, and who had told Marlena, the first day he came to assess the work, that he remembered this house from when he was young, that his mother had known Marvel Voss, that people in Cressfield had thought highly of her. He had done the work with the care of someone who understood that the building had a history worth respecting, and the result was a renovation that had changed what needed to change and left intact what did not, which was exactly what she had asked for. The neighbor who had brought the first casserole was there too. She was a woman in her 70s named Dorothea, who had known Marlena's grandmother for 30 years, and who had come to the door in October with a casserole and returned in subsequent months with the quiet persistence of a person who understands that grief is not a single event, but a process, and that showing up repeatedly is more useful than showing up once dramatically. She had brought a coffee cake to the opening, which she set on the refreshments table with the practiced ease of someone who has been bringing things to community events for 50 years and knows how to make a contribution without making a production of it. Marlena thanked her. Dorothea said your grandmother would have done something just like this, and she had always thought Marvel Voss had more in her than most people knew. Marlena said she had come to understand. That was quite true. Dorothea smiled and took her coffee and went to find a seat. And the morning went on, and people came in and sat at the tables and picked up the materials that Marlena had prepared. Simple, clear guides to the things she wished she had understood sooner, about savings and credit and debt and the long arithmetic of financial decisions made without adequate information. And the conversations began, the real conversations, the kind that happen when someone who has been in the difficult country of insufficient money sits down across from someone else who has also been there, and they speak to each other with the directness of that shared knowledge. This was the work. This was the thing worth doing with the thing that had been found. At the end of the afternoon, when most of the visitors had gone, and the staff she had hired were beginning to tidy up, and B was on the back porch with Franklin, who had been brought for the occasion and had surveyed it with his customary equanimity, Marlena went upstairs. She stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. The room was the same. The light came through the white curtains in its usual way. The vanity stood against the east wall, with its mirror catching what remained of the afternoon. The carved walnut frame was dark and warm in the low light. She crossed the room and sat on the little bench. She was not performing anything. She was not being observed by anyone. She was simply sitting in a place where she had sat as a child, and sitting in it now as a person who had traveled the full distance between those two moments, and was, at this particular point, beginning to understand what the journey had been for. She looked at herself in the softened glass. She looked at the reflection of the room, the bed with the quilt turned back, the wardrobe, the white curtains moving slightly in the draught, the afternoon light that was beginning its familiar seasonal deepening toward the early dusk of fall. She put her hands on the surface of the vanity, on the dark wood, worn smooth at the edges, where her grandmother's hands had rested for decades. She sat with her grandmother's hands beneath her own, in the way of people who carry the people who came before them, and she was quiet for a while, attending to the room and to the moment, and to the specific quality of the light. Her grandmother had sat here every morning, looking at the same mirror, carrying the same knowledge of what was hidden in the frame, braiding a child's hair once, watching the days accumulate into a life, understanding that the most important things were often the least visible, that what mattered was whether you were looking, whether you had trained yourself to see past the surface of things to what was actually there. It matters. Outside, downstairs, the sounds of the center being finished for the day, chairs being arranged, the coffee station being cleaned, B's voice, and briefly, Portia's in easy conversation, which was a sound she had not heard for years and which she hoped to hear more of. The particular quality of a house that has people in it again, that is occupied by purpose, that has been given back its reason for remaining. She sat at the vanity until the light had nearly gone. Then she stood and smoothed the bench cushion in the way her grandmother had done, and went downstairs to where her daughter was waiting, and the work was ready to continue. And somewhere in the old mirror behind her, in the silver-edged glass that softened everything it reflected and made it look a little more dignified than it might otherwise have appeared, the room held its shape. The vanity stood where it had always stood. The carved walnut frame, with its repeated design of leaves or waves or both, caught the last of the light and held it. Briefly, the way all good things hold the light they have been given, just long enough for someone paying attention to see it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.